The storm roared over Forsyth, Georgia, a beast of wind and fury tearing at Eleanor Grayson's fragile world. She stood in her crumbling wooden house, clutching the edge of her desk as the oil lamp flickered wildly, casting jagged shadows across the room. Outside, the cotton fields thrashed under a sky black as coal, and a deafening crack split the air. A tree limb crashed through her window, showering glass across the floor. Eleanor's heart pounded, her breath shallow, as the laptop screen glowed with the latest rejection email. Your manuscript lacks the spark we're seeking. In that moment, the storm outside mirrored the chaos within her, a writer on the brink, alone and breaking. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The wind howled through the shattered window, tugging at the papers strewn across Eleanor's desk. Drafts of stories no one wanted, red-marked bills she couldn't pay, and a sad skyline of cold coffee cups. She was 40, but the weight of her failures made her feel decades older. The lamp's flame danced, threatening to die, and she stumbled to the kitchen, her bare feet crunching on glass. With trembling hands, she lit a second lamp, its weak glow barely pushing back the darkness. The storm raged on, a relentless reminder of how small she felt, how insignificant her dreams had become. Eleanor sank into a chair, running her fingers through her dark, tangled hair. She'd inherited this house from her mother, Abigail Wentworth, a name that once lit up Forsyth like a firefly in the night. Abigail had been a celebrated novelist, her books lining shelves across America, her words weaving hope into the hearts of millions. Eleanor, though, was no Abigail. She'd tried to follow in those footsteps, pouring her soul into manuscripts that came back with polite rejections, or worse, silence. The email still burned in her mind, each word a splinter under her skin. Lacks the spark. What did that even mean? She'd given everything she had, and it still wasn't enough. The storm's fury began to ebb, leaving a mournful whistle as it swept through the cotton fields beyond her porch. Eleanor stood, drawn to the sound, and pushed open the screen door. The air was thick with a scent of wet earth and bruised grass, the red dirt road glistening under a sliver of moonlight breaking through the clouds. She inhaled deeply, the coolness a fleeting balm against the heat of her frustration. She couldn't stay here, not tonight, not with a broken window and the broken dreams pressing in around her. Grabbing her worn jacket from a hook, she stepped outside, the wind tugging at her like an impatient child. Her old pickup truck sat in the yard, its paint chipped and faded, a relic of better days. She climbed in, the engine sputtering to life with off-road vehicles IRVS as she turned the key. The headlights cut through the lingering mist as she drove aimlessly through Forsyth's quiet streets, past the shuttered storefronts and the old oak trees still dripping from the storm. She didn't know where she was going. Just away. Away from the house, the email, the suffocating weight of her own inadequacy. The radio crackled with static, a gospel station fading in and out, and she switched it off, letting the silence fill the cab. As she rounded a bend, a faded sign caught her eye, swaying in the damp breeze. Forsyth Animal Rescue, Pet Adoption Day. It hung crookedly over a squat brick building, its windows plastered with photos of hopeful dogs and cats. Eleanor slowed, her foot easing off the gas. She hadn't planned to stop, hadn't planned anything, but something pulled her into the gravel lot. The storm had left puddles that reflected the dim streetlights, and she parked near the entrance, her hands still tight on the wheel. Why was she here? She didn't need a pet, didn't need another mouth to feed, when she could barely feed herself. Yet she couldn't drive away. The shelter door creaked as she pushed it open, the smell of kibble and wet fur hitting her like a wave. Inside, the place buzzed with quiet energy, volunteers chatting, dogs yipping from their kennels. Eleanor stood frozen, unsure, until a woman approached her. Ruth was 70 if she was a day. Her silver hair pulled into a loose bun, her smile warm but tinged with a weariness that matched Eleanor's own. "You look like you could use a friend," Ruth said, her southern drawl soft as a lullaby's. Eleanor managed a weak nod, her eyes drifting past Ruth to the kennels lining the walls. And then she saw her. In the far corner, away from the clamor, sat a German shepherd, her muzzle gray. With age, her coat patchy but proud. She didn't bark or leap like the others, just watched, her deep brown eyes locking onto Eleanor's with a stillness that stopped her breath. Those eyes held something, wisdom maybe, or recognition, and Eleanor felt a tug, sharp and sudden, deep in her chest. She stepped closer, glass crunching faintly under her boots from the storm's debris, and knelt before the kennel. The nameplate read, "Daisy," scratched and worn, like the dog herself. Ruth hovered nearby, her voice low. "She's been here a while. Folks pass her by. Too old, they say." But Eleanor barely heard her. Daisy's gaze didn't waver, and for the first time that night, maybe in years, Eleanor felt seen. Not as a failure, not as Abigail's shadow, but as herself. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold bars, and Daisy shifted, slow and deliberate, to meet her touch. A paw rested on her hand, gentle but firm, and Eleanor's throat tightened. What was this? Who was this dog? And why did it feel like she'd been waiting for her all along? Eleanor knelt before Daisy's kennel, the cold concrete biting into her knees, but she barely noticed. The storm's echoes still rattled in her mind, glass shards from her broken window a distant sting compared to the weight of those brown eyes staring back at her. Daisy didn't move, didn't bark, didn't wag her tail like the other dogs clamoring for attention along the shelter's narrow aisle. She just watched, her gray muzzled face calm, her gaze steady and deep, as if she'd been waiting for this moment, for Eleanor, long before the wind had driven her here. The air smelled of damp fur and antiseptic, a sharp contrast to the earthy scent of the cotton fields outside, and Eleanor's breath caught as Daisy's paw rested on her hand through the bars. It was a touch so gentle, so deliberate, it felt like a question. "Are you ready?" Around her, the shelter hummed with life. A young couple cooed over a bouncy terrier pup, its yips piercing the low murmur of voices. A volunteer swept the floor, her broom scraping rhythmically against the concrete. But Eleanor's world narrowed to Daisy, to the quiet dignity in her stillness. She'd never had a dog, never wanted one, really. Her life was a mess of unpaid bills and unwritten pages. She couldn't even take care of herself. Yet here she was, her fingers curling around the bars, unable to look away from this old German shepherd who seemed to see right through her. "You sure about her?" Ruth's voice broke the spell, soft but edged with caution. The older woman stood a few steps back, her arms crossed, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. "She's been returned twice, you know. Folks say she's too stubborn, too set in her ways. Not much for cuddles or fetch, either." Ruth's eyes flicked to Daisy, then back to Eleanor, searching for something, doubt, maybe, or hesitation. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She felt Daisy's paw, warm and steady, and a strange certainty settled over her, drowning out the chaos of the night. I don't need fetch, Eleanor said, her voice rough from disuse. She stood, brushing the dust from her jeans, and met Ruth's gaze. I just need something. She didn't know how to finish that sentence, didn't know what she needed, not really. But Daisy's presence felt like an answer she hadn't known she was seeking. Ruth nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and pulled a clipboard from a nearby shelf. All right then. Let's get the papers done. She's yours if you want her. The adoption process was a blur. Eleanor scribbled her name on form she barely read, her hands trembling not from the cold but from the weight of her choice. She handed over her credit card for the fee, wincing as she thought of her dwindling bank account, then drove to the general store down the road. The storm had left the street slick and quiet, the cotton fields stretching into the darkness like a sea of white ghosts. Inside she grabbed the basics, dog food, a water bowl, a leash, and then on a whim, a plush dog bed with a price tag that made her stomach twist. It was more than she could afford, more than she should have spent, but she couldn't bring Daisy home to nothing. Back at the shelter, Daisy waited by the door, leashed and ready, her ears perked slightly as Eleanor approached. Ruth handed over the lead, her fingers brushing Eleanor's with a warmth that felt like encouragement. "Take good care of her," she said, and Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure she knew how. The drive home was silent, the truck's engine rumbling beneath them, Daisy sitting tall in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Eleanor stole glances at her, wondering what she'd just done, what this dog would mean to her life. The house was a wreck when they arrived. Glass glittered on the floor from the broken window, and the wind had scattered papers across the room like fallen leaves. Eleanor set the dog bed near her desk, arranging it with care, then filled the bowls with water and kibble. "Here you go, girl," she said, her voice soft, almost shy. Daisy patted over, her nails clicking on the hardwood, and sniffed the bed. Then, with a quiet huff, she turned away and settled on the bare floor beside Eleanor's chair, curling into a tight ball. Eleanor stared, a mix of amusement and confusion flickering through her. "Guess you're not one for luxury, huh?" She sat at her desk, the laptop still open to that damning email. The cursor blinked, a taunting heartbeat, and she reached to close the screen, but Daisy shifted, her head lifting, those brown eyes locking onto hers again. It wasn't a command, not exactly, but it felt like a nudge, a quiet insistence that kept Eleanor's hand hovering over the keys. She sighed, leaning back in her chair, and let her gaze drift to the broken window. The night was still now, the storm gone, but the air carried a chill that seeped into her bones. Daisy's warmth beside her was a small comfort, a tether in the dark. What had she gotten herself into? She didn't know this dog, didn't know her past or her quirks, but as Daisy rested her chin on her paws, watching her with that same steady gaze, Eleanor felt something shift, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself, letting in a sliver of light she hadn't expected. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe it wasn't. All she knew was that Daisy was here now. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel quite so alone. Eleanor sat at her desk, the oil lamp casting a soft glow over the scattered pages of her latest failed draft. The cursor blinked on the screen, a relentless pulse mocking her stalled words, and the silence of the house pressed in around her, broken only by the faint, steady breathing of Daisy at her side. The old German shepherd had claimed her spot on the hardwood floor beside the chair, her gray muzzle resting on her paws, her eyes half closed but alert. It had been 3 days since Eleanor brought her home. 3 days of quiet coexistence, and already Daisy's presence felt like a fixture, as natural as the creak of the porch or the rustle of the cotton fields outside. She'd tried to write that morning, her fingers hovering over the keys, but the rejection email still lingered in her mind like a bruise. Lacks the spark. The words looped through her thoughts, sharp and accusing, and she'd spent hours staring at the same paragraph, unable to move forward. Daisy had watched her the whole time, her head tilting slightly whenever Eleanor sighed or muttered to herself. Then, when she'd pushed back from the desk to scroll through social media, a distraction she knew she'd regret, Daisy had stirred. A cold nose pressed against her hand, firm and insistent, nudging her back to the keyboard. Eleanor had laughed, a dry, brittle sound, and muttered, "What? You're my editor now?" But she'd kept typing, the dog's quiet pressure a strange kind of encouragement. Now, as dusk settled over Forsyth, the room grew dim, the lamp's light pooling around her like a fragile halo. Eleanor leaned back, rubbing her eyes, and glanced at Daisy. "You're a tough boss. You know that?" she said, her voice soft. Daisy's ears twitched, but she didn't move, her gaze steady and patient. It was uncanny, almost, how the dog seemed to sense her every falter, how she knew exactly when to intervene. Eleanor had never been one for pets, never understood the fuss people made over them, but Daisy was different. She wasn't loud or demanding, she just was. A silent companion who filled the empty spaces Eleanor hadn't realized were there. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Daisy lifted her head, ears perked, as Eleanor stood and crossed the room, her bare feet brushing the cool floor. She opened the door to find Hattie, her neighbor from down the road, standing on the porch with a foil-covered plate in her hands. Hattie was 68, her face lined with years of sun and laughter, her gray curls peeking out from a faded scarf. "Brought you some cornbread," she said, her southern drawl thick and warm. "Heard that storm did a number on your window. Thought you might need a little comfort." Eleanor managed to smile, stepping aside to let her in. "Thanks, Hattie. It's been a rough couple of days." Hattie bustled into the kitchen, setting the plate on the counter, her eyes darting to Daisy with a flicker of curiosity. "Well, now, who's this?" she asked, crouching slightly to get a better look. Daisy sat up, her posture regal despite her age, and regarded Hattie with that same calm scrutiny she'd given Eleanor at the shelter. "That's Daisy," Eleanor said, leaning against the counter. "Got her from the rescue a few days ago." Hattie straightened, her hands on her hips, and let out a low whistle. "She's a beauty, ain't she? Got that look about her, like she's seen things." She paused, her gaze softening. "Reminds me of your mama, you know. Abigail used to have a way with animals, always said they understood more than we gave 'em credit for." Eleanor's chest tightened at the mention of her mother. Abigail Wentworth had been a giant in Forsyth, her novels a source of pride for the town long after she'd passed. Hattie had known her, had been a friend in the way small-town folks often were, and her words stirred a mix of pride and pain in Eleanor. "Yeah, well, I didn't inherit that part," she said, forcing a laugh. "Just the stubbornness, maybe." Hattie chuckled, but her eyes lingered on Daisy. "Maybe you got more than you think. Your mama'd be proud, seeing you take in a soul like that." She nodded toward the dog, then headed for the door. "You let me know if you need anything, hear? Storm's gone, but it don't mean the mess is." Eleanor thanked her, closing the door as Hattie's footsteps faded into the evening. Back at her desk, Eleanor unwrapped the cornbread, the warm, buttery scent filling the room. She broke off a piece, offering it to Daisy, who sniffed it politely before turning away. "Not a fan, huh?" Eleanor said, popping it into her own mouth. She settled into her chair, the laptop screen glaring back at her, and tried to write again. The words came slow, halting, each sentence a struggle. She stopped, her fingers hovering, and Daisy shifted beside her, a soft nudge against her leg. All right," Eleanor muttered, resuming her typing. The dog's persistence was almost comical, but it worked. She kept going, line by line, the story inching forward. Hours later, the house was dark, the lamp's oil nearly spent. Eleanor leaned back, exhaustion tugging at her, and stared at the screen. She'd written more tonight than she had in weeks. Not much, but enough to feel like a start. Daisy lay still, her breathing a quiet rhythm, and Eleanor reached down to stroke her fur. It was soft under her fingers, worn but comforting, and Daisy leaned into the touch, her eyes half open. "You're something else," Eleanor whispered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She didn't know what it was about this dog, why she cared, why she stayed. But Daisy's presence was a lifeline, thin and fragile, pulling her from the edge. Outside, the cotton fields whispered in the night breeze, a sound that felt less lonely now. Eleanor turned off the lamp, the room falling into shadow, and for the first time in months she didn't dread the silence that followed. The fog rolled thick over Forsyth that morning, a gray shroud that muffled the sparrows' chatter and cloaked the cotton fields in a ghostly haze. Eleanor sat at her desk, the oil lamp casting a faint circle of light across her laptop, its screen still open to the chapter she'd wrestled with the night before. Daisy lay beside her, her gray muzzle resting on her paws, her breathing a steady rhythm that had become as familiar as the creak of the old house. 3 days with Daisy had shifted something in Eleanor. Nothing grand, just a quiet thread of purpose woven into the fabric of her despair. She'd written more, not much, but enough to feel the flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Possibility. The sharp ring of her phone sliced through the stillness, jolting her upright. Daisy's ears perked, her head lifting as Eleanor fumbled for the device on the cluttered desk. The screen flashed an unknown number, and she hesitated, her thumb hovering over the decline button. Unknown calls usually meant bill collectors or telemarketers, neither of which she had the energy for today. But something, maybe the fog, maybe Daisy's watchful gaze, made her press accept instead. She held the phone to her ear, her voice raspy from disuse. "Hello? Is this Eleanor Grayson?" The voice on the other end was soft, tinged with a southern lilt, but carried an undercurrent of urgency that made Eleanor sit straighter. "My name's Clara Wentworth. I'm Abigail's niece. Your cousin, I suppose. I got your number from the county records. I hope I ain't intrudin'." Eleanor's breath caught, her mind racing to place the name. Abigail Wentworth, her mother, had been gone 3 years, her legacy a shadow Eleanor could never escape. Clara's name rang a faint bell, a distant memory of family gatherings she'd barely attended as a child. "No, it's fine," Eleanor managed, though her throat felt tight. "What's this about?" Daisy shifted closer, her warm bulk pressing against Eleanor's leg as if sensing the tension coiling in her chest. Clara paused, the silence stretching just long enough to make Eleanor's pulse quicken. "It's about your dog," Clara said finally. "The German shepherd you adopted, Daisy, right? She belonged to Aunt Abigail. She went missin' from the farmstead a few months before she passed. I didn't know where she'd gone until I heard it from Ruth at the shelter. Eleanor's eyes dropped to Daisy, who stared back with the same deep, knowing gaze she'd had since the first day. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a mix of shock and disbelief swirling in her gut. "You're saying Daisy was my mother's?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The idea seemed impossible. Abigail had never mentioned a dog, not in the rare letters or the even rarer phone calls before her death. But Clara's tone was firm, unwavering. "Yes, ma'am." She was special to her, more than just a pet. Aunt Abigail used to say something strange about her. "Daisy will find the right one." Never made much sense till now. The words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic, and Eleanor's mind spun. She pictured her mother, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, sitting in her study with a dog at her feet, a scene she'd never witnessed but could almost see. "What does that mean?" she asked, her fingers tightening around the phone. Clara's laugh was soft, tinged with sadness. "I ain't sure myself, but I'd like to talk more, if you're willin'. Could you come out to the Wentworth farmstead? It's about 20 miles north of Forsyth, off the old highway. There's something you oughta see." Eleanor's first instinct was to say no. The farmstead was a place she'd avoided since Abigail's death, a monument to a legacy she'd never lived up to. But Daisy's head tilted slightly. Her eyes locked on Eleanor's, and that quiet nudge, the same one that had kept her writing, pushed her forward. "All right," she said, surprising herself. "I can be there this afternoon." Clara's relief was palpable through the line. "Thank you, Eleanor. I'll see you then." The call ended and Eleanor set the phone down, her hands trembling. She looked at Daisy, who hadn't moved, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of questions swirling through Eleanor's mind. "You were hers," she murmured, reaching down to stroke the dog's soft fur. Daisy leaned into the touch, her tail giving a single slow thump against the floor. What did it mean that Abigail's dog had found her of all people? And what was waiting at the farmstead? She stood, grabbing her keys from the counter, and Daisy rose with her, nails clicking on the hardwood as she followed to the door. The fog outside was thick, curling around the cotton fields like smoke, but Eleanor didn't hesitate. She opened the truck's passenger door, and Daisy leapt in, settling into her usual spot, with an ease that felt almost rehearsed. The engine sputtered to life, and Eleanor pulled onto the red dirt road, the headlights cutting through the mist. Her stomach churned with nerves, but Daisy's calm beside her was a lifeline, pulling her toward whatever lay ahead. The drive was quiet, the world outside a blur of gray and green. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to Abigail, her mother's voice, sharp and commanding, reading from one of her novels at a rare family dinner, her hands, elegant and sure, signing books for adoring fans. Eleanor had worshipped her once, then resented her. The gap between their lives too wide to bridge. Now, with Daisy beside her, that gap felt different. Less a chasm, more a thread waiting to be followed. She didn't know what Clara wanted to show her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was tied to the dog, to the past she'd spent years running from. As the truck rattled down the highway, the fog began to lift, revealing the rolling fields and distant pines of rural Georgia. Eleanor's grip tightened on the wheel, her mind buzzing with questions she couldn't answer, not yet. Daisy sat tall, her ears twitching at every sound, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Whatever waited at the farmstead, Eleanor knew one thing. Daisy was leading her there step by step into a story she hadn't written but was somehow already part of. The Wentworth farmstead loomed ahead as Eleanor's truck crunched over the gravel drive. its weathered wooden frame rising from the cotton fields like a relic of a forgotten time. The fog had burned off, leaving a pale autumn sun to filter through the pines, casting long shadows across the sagging porch and peeling paint. Daisy sat upright in the passenger seat, her ears perked forward, her body tense with an alertness Eleanor hadn't seen before. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, a faint sweetness undercut by the musty tang of old wood. Eleanor parked beside a rusted tractor, her hands lingering on the keys as she stared at the house she'd avoided for years. Clara stepped onto the porch as Eleanor climbed out, her dark hair pulled back, her sharp eyes, so like Abigail's, softened by a cautious smile. She was younger than Eleanor, maybe mid-30s, but carried herself with a grace that spoke of old Southern roots. "Glad you made it," she said, her voice warm but measured as if testing the waters. Daisy leapt down beside Eleanor, her nails clicking on the gravel, and Clara's gaze lingered on the dog, a flicker of recognition passing over her face. "She looks good," Clara murmured, almost to herself, before gesturing toward the door. "Come on in. Got some coffee brewin'." Inside, the parlor was a time capsule. Faded floral wallpaper, a threadbare rug, and shelves groaning under the weight of Abigail's books. The smell of coffee mingled with the scent of old paper, and Eleanor's chest tightened as memories flooded back. Abigail's voice echoing through these rooms, her laughter sharp and rare. Clara poured 2 mugs, handing one to Eleanor, and they settled at a small table, Daisy lying between them, her eyes darting between their faces. "She used to sit just like that," Clara said, nodding at Daisy. "Right by Aunt Abigail's chair, listening to every word." Eleanor sipped the coffee, its bitterness grounding her. "You said she was special to her," she prompted, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Clara nodded, wrapping her hands around her mug. "More than special. Aunt Abigail treated her like a partner. Read her drafts aloud to her like Daisy was her first critic. Said she'd know if a story was worth keeping just by the way Daisy looked at her." Clara's lips quirked into a half-smile, but her eyes were distant, lost in memory. "I thought it was just her gettin' eccentric near the end, but now, seein' her with you, I ain't so sure." The words stirred something in Eleanor, a mix of awe and unease. She glanced at Daisy, who watched her with that same quiet intensity, and felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "Why me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Clara leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "That's what I want to figure out. Come with me. There's something in her study you need to see." She stood, and Eleanor followed, Daisy padding behind them as they climbed a narrow staircase, the wood groaning under their weight. Abigail's study was a chaos of creation, manuscripts spilled across the desk, books stacked on the floor, a typewriter perched like a sentinel amid the clutter. The air was thick with the smell of dust and ink, and Eleanor's breath caught as she stepped inside. This was her mother's sanctum, a place she'd rarely been allowed to enter as a child. Clara moved to the desk, lifting a thick stack of papers bound with a faded ribbon. "This was her last work," she said, her voice soft. "She never finished it. Found it after she passed, tucked away like she meant to hide it." Eleanor took the manuscript, her hands trembling as she untied the ribbon. The top page bore Abigail's elegant script, the title simple and stark, "The Dog Who Knew." She turned to the first chapter, and the words hit her like a punch to the gut. The rejection letter glowed on her screen, another nail in the coffin of her dreams. Outside, the cotton fields whispered secrets she couldn't hear until the dog came, an old German shepherd with eyes that held the weight of years. Eleanor's knees buckled and she sank into a chair, the pages rustling in her grip. It was her life, her house, her failures, Daisy, written years before she'd ever lived it. "How?" she whispered, her voice raw. Clara knelt beside her, her hand resting lightly on Eleanor's arm. "I don't know. She started this 3 years ago, worked on it till the end. I thought it was just a story, but now—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking to Daisy, who had settled at Eleanor's feet, her presence a quiet confirmation. Eleanor flipped through the pages, her heart pounding as the details piled up, the broken window, the late-night writing, the dog's nudges. It was impossible, yet there it was, in her mother's hand. "There's more," Clara said, reaching into a drawer. She pulled out a worn leather journal, its edges soft from years of handling, and placed it on the desk. "She wrote about James in here, your daddy. Said he left 'cause he couldn't live in her shadow. Couldn't bear the weight of her name. Daisy was his first, you know, before she was hers." Eleanor's head snapped up, her breath hitching. James, her father, had been a ghost in her life, a man who'd walked out when she was 3, leaving her and her mother with nothing but silence. She opened the journal, the pages crackling under her fingers. Abigail's words spilled out, raw and unguarded. "James left today, took his stories and his shame. Daisy stayed like she knew I'd need her more. I keep hoping he'll come back, that she'll bring him home." Eleanor's eyes blurred with tears, the weight of it crashing over her. Her mother's pain, her father's absence, Daisy's role in it all. She looked down at the dog, who met her gaze with a calm that felt almost sacred. "What did she mean, bring him home?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Clara's expression softened, a mix of sorrow and hope. "I think she meant you, Eleanor. Daisy found you, didn't she? Maybe this is what she wanted, for you to finish what she started." Eleanor clutched the manuscript and journal, her mind reeling. The farmstead faded around her, the world narrowing to Daisy's steady presence and the pages in her hands. Whatever this was, a story, a legacy, a reckoning, she was in it now, and there was no turning back. Eleanor sat on her porch as dusk settled over Forsyth, the cotton fields glowing faintly under the last threads of sunlight. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of red dirt and the distant hum of crickets, but her mind was miles away, tangled in the pages she'd brought back from the Wentworth farmstead. Abigail's manuscript and journal rested heavy in her lap, their worn edges pressing into her palms like a silent plea. Daisy lay beside her, stretched out on the weathered boards, her gray muzzle catching the fading light. The dog's deep brown eyes followed Eleanor's every move, steady and patient, as if she knew the storm of questions brewing inside her. The drive back from Clara's had been quiet, the truck rattling down the red dirt roads while Eleanor's thoughts churned. Abigail's words, the dog who knew, had carved themselves into her, each line a mirror to her own life. How could her mother have written this years ago, before the rejection emails, before the broken window, before Daisy? And James, her father, a man she'd barely known, reduced to a shadow in Abigail's journal, a failed writer who'd fled her mother's brilliance. Daisy had been his, Clara said, before she was Abigail's, and now she was Eleanor's. The weight of that thread, spanning decades, tying her to a family she'd never truly understood, pressed down on her chest until she could hardly breathe. She opened the journal again, her fingers trembling as she traced Abigail's elegant script. James left today, took his stories and his shame. Daisy stayed like she knew I'd need her more. The words blurred as tears welled up, not just for her mother's pain, but for the ache of her own abandonment. Eleanor had been 3 when James walked out, leaving her and her mother in this very house with nothing but silence and a few faded photographs. She'd built a life around that absence, a wall of resentment she'd never thought to question, until now. Daisy shifted, her nose brushing Eleanor's hand, and she wiped her eyes, forcing herself to keep reading. I keep hoping he'll come back, that she'll bring him home. Home to what? To Abigail? To her? The idea felt absurd, impossible, yet Daisy's presence made it real. Inside, the house was dim, the oil lamp casting long shadows across the clutter of her desk. Eleanor set the manuscript and journal down, her hands still shaky, and moved to the kitchen. She rummaged through a drawer, pulling out an old cigar box she hadn't touched in years. A relic of her childhood, filled with keepsakes she'd avoided. The lid creaked as she opened it, revealing a handful of Polaroids and a tarnished silver locket. She lifted a photo. James, young and dark-haired, standing in the cotton fields with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Abigail's eyes, her eyes, stared back at her. And Eleanor's throat tightened. He looked so much like her mother, so much like her it hurt to see. Daisy patted over, settling at her feet, and Eleanor sank to the floor beside her, the photo trembling in her grip. "You knew him," she whispered, her voice breaking. Daisy's ears twitched, her head tilting slightly, and Eleanor ran her fingers through the dog's soft fur, grounding herself in its warmth. She didn't know what to do with this, didn't know how to find a man who'd vanished decades ago, or why she should, but Clara's voice echoed in her mind. Maybe this is what she wanted, for you to finish what she started. Finish what? The manuscript? The story of their fractured family? Eleanor wasn't sure she had the strength. The phone rang, cutting through her reverie, and Daisy's head snapped up. Eleanor rose, her knees stiff, and grabbed it from the counter. Clara's number flashed on the screen, and she answered, her voice hoarse. "Hey, Clara." The line crackled faintly, then Clara's soft drawl came through. "Eleanor, I've been thinking. There's something I didn't tell you earlier. James, he was spotted in Albany a few years back. Worked at a bookstore there, according to a friend of mine. Might be a long shot, but if you're looking for him..." She trailed off, leaving the decision in Eleanor's hands. Albany, Georgia, 60 miles south, a small city nestled along the Flint River. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a mix of dread and curiosity surging through her. "You think he's still there?" she asked, glancing at Daisy, who watched her with that same quiet intensity. Clara sighed. "I don't know. He moved around a lot after he left, but it's the last place I heard of. Thought you should know." Eleanor thanked her, ending the call, and stood frozen in the kitchen, the photo of James still clutched in her hand. She didn't decide so much as surrender. Grabbing her keys, she opened the truck's passenger door, and Daisy leapt in, her movement slow but sure. The night was clear now, stars piercing the black sky above the cotton fields, and Eleanor drove south, the hum of the engine a steady pulse beneath her racing thoughts. Albany loomed ahead, its lights a faint glow on the horizon, and she parked outside a weathered bookstore on Broad Avenue. "Otis's Rare Reads," the sign read, its paint chipped and curling. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. A man sat behind the counter, his white hair thinning, his glasses perched low on his nose. Otis, she assumed, looked up as the bell jingled, his face creasing into a curious smile. "Evenin'," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "Lookin' for something special?" Eleanor hesitated, then stepped forward, Daisy at her side. "I'm looking for someone. James Wentworth. I heard he worked here once." Otis's smile faded, recognition flickering in his eyes. "James, huh? Yeah, he was here, about 5 years back. Quiet fella, kept to himself. Loved books, though. Could talk your ear off about 'em if you got 'em going." He scratched his chin, his gaze drifting to Daisy. "That his dog? Looks familiar." Eleanor nodded, her throat dry. "Where'd he go?" Otis leaned back, his chair creaking. "Last I heard, he was living out near the Flint River in a trailer park on the edge of town. Ain't seen him since." Eleanor thanked him, her mind spinning as she led Daisy back to the truck. The Flint River wasn't far, a few miles west, a winding ribbon of water cutting through the pines. She drove in silence, Daisy sitting tall beside her, her ears twitching at every sound. The trailer park emerged from the darkness, a cluster of rusted homes half hidden by overgrown brush, and Eleanor's stomach knotted. She didn't know what she'd say if she found him, didn't know what she wanted from a man who'd left her behind. But Daisy's presence urged her on, a quiet force pulling her toward the past she'd never faced. The trailer park near the Flint River shimmered in the moonlight, its rusted husks and sagging roofs swallowed by shadows and mist. Eleanor guided her truck down a potholed road, the tires crunching over gravel as tall grass brushed the sides of the vehicle. Daisy sat rigid in the passenger seat, her ears pinned forward, her body taut with an intensity that sent a shiver through Eleanor. The air was heavy with the scent of river mud and pine, the night alive with the chirp of frogs and the distant rumble of a train. She parked near the edge of the park, her headlights sweeping over a silver Airstream trailer half concealed by wild bushes, a thin wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. Eleanor cut the engine, the silence pressing in around her, thick and suffocating. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with Otis's words. Near the Flint River, in a trailer park on the edge of town. This was it, the closest she'd ever come to James, and yet she couldn't move. Daisy whined softly, a low, urgent sound that broke through her paralysis, and Eleanor glanced at the dog. Those brown eyes, sharp and knowing, seemed to say, "We're here now. Don't stop." She took a deep breath, the cool air stinging her lungs, and stepped out, Daisy following close behind. The grass reached her knees, crackling underfoot as she approached the trailer. A stack of firewood sat neatly by the door, and an empty bird feeder swayed from a nearby tree, its paint peeling in the damp night air. Eleanor's heart thudded against her ribs, each step a battle against the urge to turn back. She raised her fist to knock, the sound hollow and sharp, but no answer came. She tried again, harder, and the door shifted slightly, creaking open an inch. "Hello?" she called, her voice swallowed by the stillness. Pushing the door wider, she peered inside. The trailer was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a lantern on a small table. Books and papers cluttered every surface. Dog-eared paperbacks, literary magazines, manuscripts in tight, slanted handwriting. A denim jacket hung over a chair, its sleeve trailing on the floor, and an empty coffee cup sat on the counter, still warm under her touch. Someone had been here moments ago, and Eleanor's pulse quickened. Daisy stepped past her, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air, her tail stiff and motionless. "Anyone home?" Eleanor tried again, stepping fully inside. The trailer felt like a cave, its walls closing in, and she scanned the chaos for any sign of James. On the table, an unfinished manuscript caught her eye, its pages covered in that same cramped script she'd seen in her childhood. James's handwriting, unmistakable from the birthday cards he'd sent until she was 7. Her breath hitched as she lifted it, the paper rough against her fingers, but before she could read more, a voice cut through the dark like a blade. "You shouldn't be here." Eleanor spun around, the manuscript slipping from her hands. James stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the moonlight, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there in the old photos. His hair was mostly gray now, his clothes loose on a thin frame, but his eyes, brown, like hers, like Abigail's, were tired and wary, pinning her in place. Daisy froze between them, her gaze flicking from Eleanor to James, her tail still. Eleanor's mouth went dry, words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times vanishing in the face of him. "James?" she said finally, her voice barely steady. "It's me, Eleanor." His mouth twisted, a grimace that might have been a smile, and he stepped inside, closing the door with a soft thud. "Took you long enough," he muttered, his tone rough but not unkind. He moved to the table, his hands twitching as he straightened the papers she'd disturbed, avoiding her eyes. They settled across from each other, the table's surface scarred with coffee rings and ink stains. The chairs creaked under their weight, and Eleanor caught the faint scent of cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes, mingling with the musty air. Daisy sat between them, her presence a quiet bridge, watching James, with a recognition that made Eleanor's chest ache. "I've been looking for you," she said, her voice steadier now. "Clara told me about Daisy, about Abigail, about you." James's face remained blank, a mask carved from years of hiding, but his fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice low, edged with something raw. Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of Abigail's manuscript and journal pressing against her memory. "I found her last story," she said. "She wrote about me, about us. And Daisy, she brought me here." His eyes flickered, a crack in his armor, and Eleanor reached into her bag, pulling out the bundle of pages Clara had given her. She slid them across the table, the paper scraping softly against the wood. "She never gave up on you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. James stared at the manuscript, his hands curling into fists, his jaw clenching as if the words might burn him. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by Daisy's soft breathing. "I couldn't do it," he said finally, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, forcing the words out. "I couldn't live in her shadow. Margaret, goddamn Wentworth, the great writer. Every story I wrote, every rejection, it was her voice in my head, telling me I'd never be enough." He looked away, his gaze drifting to the lantern's dim flame. "So I left. Left her, left you, left Daisy. Told myself it was better that way." Eleanor watched him, her anger simmering beneath a tide of pity. This wasn't the monster she'd imagined as a child, the father who'd abandoned her for some grand adventure. He was just a man, broken and small, hiding in a trailer full of regrets. "You had a daughter," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "And you left me too." James flinched, guilt flashing across his face, raw and unguarded. His mouth opened, but no words came, the apology hanging unspoken between them. She stood, the chair scraping against the floor, and grabbed the manuscript. "She wanted you to finish this," she said, her tone sharp. James shook his head, quick and desperate. "No, that's yours now." "I can't." Eleanor paused, the pages clutched to her chest, and looked at him. Really looked. His hands shook slightly, his shoulders hunched, and she saw the truth in his eyes. He'd never come back, not fully. But Daisy had. "Why me, then?" she asked, the question spilling out. "Why did Daisy find me?" James exhaled, slow and ragged, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. "Because she knew I never would have had the guts to face her, to face you." His voice dropped to a whisper, rough with emotion. "She's smarter than all of us." Eleanor's throat tightened, and she turned to Daisy, who watched them both with that same knowing calm, a thread tying them to a past neither could escape, and a future she'd have to build alone. The sky split open as Eleanor drove away from the trailer park, rain hammering the windshield of her truck with a ferocity that matched the storm in her chest. The Flint River churned beside the road, its dark waters swollen and restless, mirroring the tumult of her thoughts. Daisy sat beside her, her gray muzzle glistening with droplets from the open window, her brown eyes fixed on Eleanor with a quiet intensity that felt like a tether. James's words echoed in her ears. "She knew I never would have had the guts to face her, to face you." And they cut deeper than she'd expected, slicing through the anger she'd carried for decades and leaving a raw, aching wound in its place. She didn't know where she was going, just that she couldn't stay in that cramped trailer, couldn't sit across from the man who'd abandoned her and see the broken shell he'd become. The rain blurred the world outside, turning the pines and fields into a smear of green and gray, and Eleanor's hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles white. She'd wanted answers, hadn't she? Wanted to know why he'd left, why he'd never come back. But James's confession, his shame, his failure, didn't fill the hole he'd left. It only made it heavier, a weight she didn't know how to carry. The truck's tires skidded slightly as she pulled off the road, the riverbank looming close, its muddy edge slick and treacherous. She cut the engine, the silence swallowed by the roar of the storm, and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Rain streamed down the windows, a curtain shutting out the world, and Eleanor's breath hitched, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. She'd spent years imagining this moment, facing her father, demanding the apology he owed her, but now that it was here, it felt hollow. He wasn't the villain she'd built in her mind, just a man too weak to stay, too broken to fight. And that hurt more than anything. Daisy shifted beside her, a soft whine breaking through the rain's relentless drum. Eleanor turned, her vision blurred, and saw the dog's head tilt, her nose nudging closer. Then with a slow, deliberate grace, Daisy rested her muzzle in Eleanor's lap, her warmth seeping through the damp fabric of her jeans. The gesture was so simple, so steady, it cracked something open inside her. A sob tore free, loud and ragged, and she buried her face in Daisy's fur, her hands clutching the dog's neck as the tears came unchecked. The rain pounded harder, a wild symphony against the truck's roof, but Daisy didn't move, her breathing a quiet anchor in the chaos. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time lost its shape in the storm. Eleanor's sobs quieted, her breathing steadying as she leaned back, Daisy's head still heavy in her lap. The rain softened to a steady patter, and she wiped her eyes, the salt stinging her skin. She looked at Daisy, those wise old eyes gazing back, and felt a shift, a clarity cutting through the fog of her grief. James wouldn't give her the closure she'd craved. He couldn't. He was too far gone, too trapped in his own regrets. But Daisy had brought her here, had led her to him, and maybe that was enough. Not a reunion, not a fairy tale, but a truth she could live with. "I don't need him," she whispered, her voice rough but firm. Daisy's ears twitched, her tail giving a single thump against the seat, and Eleanor ran her fingers through the dog's damp fur, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I've got you, don't I?" Daisy huffed, a soft sound that might have been agreement, and Eleanor straightened, her resolve hardening. She didn't need James to be her father, not now, not ever. But she needed to finish what Abigail had started, to take the story her mother had left behind and make it her own. Daisy had shown her that much. The drive back to Forsyth was slow, the road slick with rain, the cotton fields shrouded in mist. Eleanor's mind churned, piecing together the fragments of the day, James's trailer, Abigail's manuscript, Daisy's quiet guidance. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the storm had faded to a drizzle, the night air cool and sharp. She led Daisy inside, the house still a mess of scattered papers and broken glass, and lit the oil lamp, its glow pooling around her desk. The manuscript sat where she'd left it, beside the journal, and she sank into her chair, Daisy settling at her feet. She opened the pages, her mother's words spilling out like a river. The rejection letter glowed on her screen, another nail in the coffin of her dreams. Eleanor's breath caught, the familiarity of it still jarring, but this time she didn't stop. She grabbed a pen, her hand steady now, and wrote a new line beneath Abigail's. But the dog came, and with her a storm that broke more than windows. It broke the silence she'd lived in too long. The words flowed, rough and unpolished, but alive, weaving her story into her mother's, Daisy's presence, a thread binding them together. Hours slipped by, the lamp's oil burning low, and Eleanor wrote until her hand cramped, until the page blurred before her eyes. She leaned back, exhaustion tugging at her, and looked down at Daisy, who hadn't moved, her chin resting on her paws, her eyes half closed but watchful. "We're doing this, aren't we?" she said, her voice soft. Daisy's tail thumped once, a quiet affirmation, and Eleanor felt a spark, small, fragile, but real. It wasn't just Abigail's story anymore. It was hers, and she'd finish it, for both of them. The morning dawned cold and gray over Forsyth, a thin frost clinging to the cotton fields like a shroud. Eleanor woke with a start, her neck stiff from falling asleep at her desk, the oil lamp long since burned out. The manuscript lay open before her, pages scattered with her own jagged handwriting, a testament to the night's quiet fury. Daisy's spot beside her chair was empty, and a jolt of panic shot through her, until she saw the dog curled up by the bed in the next room, her gray form still and silent. Eleanor's heart stumbled, her breath catching as she slid from the chair and knelt beside her. "Hey, girl," she whispered, her hand trembling as it hovered over Daisy's fur. The dog didn't stir, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, and Eleanor's throat tightened. She'd seen Daisy slow down over the past week, her steps heavier, her naps longer, but this was different, a stillness that felt wrong, final. "Come on, wake up," she said, her voice cracking as she gently shook her. Daisy's eyes fluttered open, those deep brown depths fixing on Eleanor's face, and relief flooded her, sharp and fleeting. But the look in them was distant, peaceful, as if Daisy were already slipping away. Eleanor gathered her in her arms, the dog's weight heavier than she'd expected, and stumbled to her feet. You're okay," she muttered more to herself than to Daisy, as she grabbed her keys and rushed to the truck. The engine sputtered to life, and she drove to the vet in Forsyth, the only one open this early, her hands shaking on the wheel. Daisy lay across the seat, her head in Eleanor's lap, her breathing a faint whisper against the hum of the road. The cotton fields blurred past, the frost glinting in the weak light, and Eleanor's mind raced. She's fine. She has to be fine. But deep down, she knew. The vet's office was a sterile blur of white walls and antiseptic smell. Dr. Ellis, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, met them at the door, her expression softening as she saw Daisy. "Let's get her inside," she said, her voice gentle but firm, and Eleanor followed, cradling Daisy as they moved to an exam room. The table was cold under the dog's limp form, and Eleanor stood beside her, her hand buried in Daisy's fur, as Dr. Ellis checked her pulse, her breathing, her eyes. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint tick of a clock, until the vet looked up, her face etched with compassion. "She's shutting down, Eleanor," Dr. Ellis said softly. "Her heart's weak, her kidneys too. She's old, older than we thought, maybe. There's not much we can do." Eleanor's knees buckled and she sank to the floor beside the table, her hands still clutching Daisy's. "No," she whispered, tears spilling hot and fast. "She can't. She's all I've got." Dr. Ellis knelt beside her, her hand resting lightly on Eleanor's shoulder. "She's been holding on for you. But she's tired. It's time." Eleanor nodded, numb, and climbed onto the table, pulling Daisy into her lap. The dog's eyes opened again, locking onto hers, and Eleanor saw everything in them: the shelter, the farmstead, James, the nights of writing under the lamp's glow. "You found me," she choked out, her voice breaking as she pressed her forehead to Daisy's. "You gave me everything." Daisy's tail thumped weakly against her leg one last time, and then, with a soft sigh, her breathing stopped, her body growing still in Eleanor's arms. The room spun, grief crashing over her like a wave, and Eleanor held Daisy tight, sobbing into her fur as Dr. Ellis stepped out, giving her space. She thought of Abigail reading to Daisy, of James leaving her behind, of the manuscript that had brought them all together. Daisy had been the thread, the guide, and now she was gone. When the tears slowed, Eleanor kissed her muzzle, whispering, "Thank you," before letting Dr. Ellis take her away. The drive to the Wentworth farmstead was a haze, Daisy's absence a void beside her. Clara met her at the gate, her eyes red-rimmed, and they walked together to the old oak tree at the edge of the property, its branches heavy with autumn leaves. Eleanor carried a wooden box, Daisy's ashes, and a copy of the manuscript, its pages worn from her hands. They dug a small grave in silence, the earth soft and cool, and Eleanor placed the box inside, the manuscript beside it. "She belongs here," she said, her voice rough with emotion, "with Abigail." Clara nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, and they covered the grave, the soil patting down with a finality that echoed in Eleanor's bones. "She did what she was meant to," Clara said softly, her hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Brought you back to us." Eleanor looked at the fresh earth, the manuscript buried with Daisy, and felt the weight of it. Grief? Yes, but also gratitude. Daisy had led her through the dark, to James, to Abigail's story, to herself. She knelt by the grave, her fingers tracing the soil, and whispered, "You did it, girl." The wind stirred the leaves above, rustling the pages in her memory, and Eleanor stood, Clara beside her, the oak a silent witness to their loss. Daisy was gone, but her story wasn't, not yet. Eleanor would finish it, for her, for Abigail, for the family she'd found in the ashes of the past. The days after Daisy's death blurred into a gray haze for Eleanor, the silence in her Forsyth home a weight that pressed against her chest. The cotton fields outside stretched endlessly under a pale November sky, their white tufts stark against the red dirt, but the beauty felt distant, muted without Daisy's steady presence beside her. She sat at her desk, the oil lamp casting a dim glow over the scattered pages of Abigail's manuscript, now interwoven with her own words. The house was too quiet, no clicking nails on hardwood, no soft breaths beside her chair, and the emptiness gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the dog who changed everything. Eleanor's hands hovered over the pages, her fingers tracing the lines she'd written that rainy night after leaving James. But the dog came, and with her, a storm that broke more than windows. It broke the silence she'd lived in too long. The words felt alive, a pulse beneath the ink, and she knew she couldn't stop now. Daisy had led her here, to Abigail's story, to James, to this moment. And she owed it to her to finish what they'd started. She grabbed a pen, her grip unsteady but determined, and began to write again, pouring her grief into the narrative, weaving it into the fabric of her mother's unfinished tale. The story shifted under her hands, no longer just Abigail's vision, but a tapestry of their lives, hers, James's, Daisy's. She wrote of a woman broken by rejection, her dreams crumbling under the weight of her mother's legacy, until an old dog with knowing eyes pulled her from the wreckage. She described the storm that shattered her window, the trailer by the river where she faced a father too frail to fight, the rain that washed away her anger. Daisy became more than a companion in the pages. She was the thread stitching together a family torn apart, a quiet guide leading them through the dark. Hours melted away, the lamp's oil burning low, and Eleanor barely noticed the ache in her hand or the chill seeping through the broken window. She wrote until the words blurred, until the story reached a turning point, the moment the dog's breath stilled, leaving the woman to carry on alone. She paused, her pen hovering, and looked at the empty spot where Daisy used to lie. Tears welled up, but she didn't wipe them away. They fell onto the page, smudging the ink, and she kept going, the pain fueling her. This was her story now, hers and Daisy's, and she'd see it through. The next morning she drove to the Wentworth farmstead, the manuscript clutched in her lap, its pages heavier with her additions. Clara met her on the porch, her sharp eyes softening as she took in Eleanor's drawn face. "You look like you ain't slept," she said, her southern drawl gentle with concern. Eleanor managed a faint smile, handing her the stack of papers. "I haven't, but it's done. Or close to it. I need you to read it." Clara took the manuscript, her fingers brushing the edges with reverence, and nodded. "I'll get it to someone who can do something with it. Aunt Abigail's name still carries weight." Clara was true to her word. Within days, she'd sent the manuscript to Riverside Publishing in Atlanta, a house that had once rejected Eleanor's work, but revered Abigail's. Eleanor tried not to hope. Hope had burned her too many times. But when Clara called a week later, her voice thick with excitement, she couldn't help the flutter in her chest. "They want it," Clara said, the line crackling with her joy. "They're calling it Daisy's Last Tale, under both your names, Abigail Wentworth and Eleanor Grayson. A collaboration across time, they said. It's going to print." Eleanor sank onto her couch, the phone trembling in her hand. "Both our names," she whispered, the weight of it sinking in. Clara laughed, a bright, unguarded sound. "Yours and hers together. They're rushing it for spring, say it's got heart. Something special. Daisy did that, didn't she?" Eleanor nodded, though Clara couldn't see. and ended the call, her eyes drifting to the spot where Daisy's bed still sat, unused. Special didn't cover it. Daisy had given her this, had given her everything. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Riverside sent editors to refine the manuscript, their notes sharp but respectful, and Eleanor worked late into the night, the oil lamp her constant companion. The book launched in April, its cover a silhouette of a German shepherd against a sunset, Abigail's name in gold above Eleanor's in silver. Copies flooded bookstores across Georgia, then the country, and reviews poured in. A touching exploration of family and forgiveness. One critic wrote, "Langley's final work, completed by her daughter, speaks to the lost and found." Said another, "Eleanor read them in disbelief, the words a balm to the wounds of her rejections." But it was the letters that hit her hardest. They arrived in her mailbox, handwritten and raw, from readers who saw themselves in Daisy's last tale. An elderly woman from Savannah wrote, "Your dog was like my Buster, saved me when I didn't know I needed saving." A man in Alabama shared, "I called my son after 20 years 'cause of this book. Thank you." Eleanor sat on her porch, the cotton fields stretching before her, and read each one, tears staining the pages. Daisy's story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who found hope in its words. She ordered a small bronze plaque, the words etched with care, "Daisy, the dog who chose the right one." On a crisp morning, she returned to the farmstead, Clara at her side, and secured it beside the oak where Daisy rested. The sun caught the metal, glinting off the letters, and Eleanor stepped back, her hands in her pockets. "She's part of something bigger now," Clara said, her voice soft. Eleanor nodded, the ache of loss softening into pride. Daisy had led her here, to this book, to this moment, and she'd carry that with her, always. The Forsyth bookstore buzzed with life on the evening of Eleanor's first signing, the air thick with the scent of coffee and new paper. Copies of Daisy's Last Tale lined the tables, their covers gleaming under the lights, and a crowd stretched through the aisles, spilling out the door. Eleanor stood behind a small table, her hands sweaty as she arranged her pens, her stomach a knot of nerves. She'd never done this, never faced readers who'd bought her words, who'd felt them, and the weight of it pressed against her chest. But she wasn't alone. Clara stood nearby, her smile a quiet anchor, and the memory of Daisy lingered, a steady presence in the chaos. The line moved slowly, each person a story of their own. An older woman with gray curls approached first, clutching the book to her chest, her eyes bright with tears. "This book, it felt like it was written for me," she said, her voice trembling. "I lost my husband last year and my dog. She's all I've got left. You knew that, didn't you?" Eleanor took the book, her throat tight, and signed it with care. "What's her name?" she asked, her voice soft. "Maggie," the woman replied, her face lighting up. "She's my Daisy." Eleanor nodded, handing it back. "Maggie's lucky to have you." Person after person followed, their words weaving a tapestry of connection. A man in his 70s, his hands gnarled from years of work, told her he'd reconnected with his daughter after reading the book. "Hadn't spoken in a decade," he said, his voice gruff. "Your story made me pick up the phone." A woman in a wheelchair shared how she'd found the courage to write again, inspired by Eleanor's journey. Each tale chipped away at the doubt she'd carried for years, replacing it with something warm, something real. She wasn't just a failed writer anymore. She was part of their lives, their healing. The crowd thinned as the night wore on, the bookstore growing quiet, and Eleanor's hands ached from signing. She leaned back, sipping cold coffee, when a shadow fell across the table. She looked up and her breath caught. James stood there, his silver hair combed neat, his button-down shirt wrinkled but clean. His hands fidgeted at his sides, his brown eyes, her eyes, meeting hers with a hesitance she hadn't seen in the trailer. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice steady despite the jolt in her chest. James cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Read the book. Took me a while. Ain't easy seeing myself in it." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor, then back to her. "I almost didn't come. Thought I'd lost my chance a long time ago." Eleanor watched him, the man who'd left her, who'd left Daisy, and felt the old anger stir, but it was softer now, tempered by the rain-soaked night by the river. "Why did you?" she asked, her tone even. He shifted, pulling a worn notebook from his pocket and setting it on the table. "'Cause you understood her, Abigail, better than I ever did. And Daisy," his voice cracked and he swallowed hard, "that dog knew better than me. I'm sorry, Eleanor. Too late, maybe, but I'm sorry." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Eleanor's throat tightened. She didn't forgive him, not fully, not yet. But she took the notebook, its pages filled with his tight script, and nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. They sat at a small table in the back, the crowd gone, the bookstore dimming around them. James spoke of his wandering years, jobs in bookstores, bars, small towns, his shame a chain that kept him away. Eleanor shared her struggles, Daisy's nudges, the nights under the lamp. It wasn't a reconciliation, not the tearful embrace of a movie, but a bridge, shaky, imperfect, between father and daughter. When he stood to leave, he lingered by the door, turning back. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice low, and then he was gone, his figure fading into the night. Eleanor drove home, the notebook beside her, its weight a quiet promise. The next morning she walked to the Forsyth Animal Rescue, the familiar smell of kibble and wet fur hitting her as she stepped inside. Ruth greeted her with a knowing smile, her silver hair catching the light. "Knew you'd be back," she said, and led her to the kennels. A black Labrador mix sat in the corner, her dark eyes wary but sharp, and Eleanor knelt, her hand outstretched. The dog crept forward sniffing, then licked her fingers, tentative but warm. "Her name's Sadie," Ruth said, already pulling the adoption papers. Eleanor signed them, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks, and led Sadie to the truck, the leash a new thread in her hands. Daisy's story had ended, but Sadie's was beginning, and Eleanor knew she was ready to write, to live, to carry on the legacy Daisy had left her. Eleanor sat on her porch as the sun dipped low over Forsyth, its golden light spilling across the cotton fields, painting the red dirt road in hues of amber and rust. Sadie lay beside her, the black Labrador's head resting on her paws, her dark eyes half closed in the evening calm. The air carried the faint sweetness of late autumn, a crispness that sharpened the outlines of the old house and the sprawling fields beyond. On the table beside her sat a copy of her second book, The Dog Who Stayed, its cover a silhouette of a lab against a twilight sky. Eleanor Grayson's name alone in bold silver letters. The ink was still fresh, the pages crisp, a quiet testament to the life she'd built, from the ashes Daisy had left behind. She ran her fingers over the cover, her touch light, and thought of the months since Daisy's last tale had taken flight. The first book had been a bridge, between her and Abigail, between her and James. between her and the readers who'd found solace in its words. But this one was hers, born from the silence Daisy's absence had carved, from the steady presence of Sadie at her side. It told of a woman who'd lost her guide, who'd stumbled through grief, only to find a new companion to walk with her. A story of resilience, of second chances, of the quiet strength that came from letting go and starting again. Letters still arrived, their envelopes worn from travel, their words a chorus of connection. One rested in her lap now from an 80-year-old woman in Macon. Daisy was my Maggie guiding me through the dark. Sadie's my hope now. Your book showed me it's okay to love again. Eleanor smiled, her eyes stinging, and tucked the letter into the book, a bookmark of shared healing. She'd started teaching a writing class at the Forsyth Library too, older folks mostly, their hands shaky but their stories eager, spilling onto pages she helped them shape. They called her Miss Eleanor now, their voices warm with pride, and she felt the roots she'd never known she needed sinking deep into this red Georgia earth. Sadie stirred, her tail thumping softly, and Eleanor reached down to scratch her ears, the dog leaning into her touch with a trust that mirrored Daisy's in its own way. She'd taken Sadie home that day, from the shelter, her shy steps echoing Daisy's quiet dignity, and they'd fallen into a rhythm. Walks through the fields, nights by the lamp, a new story growing under Eleanor's hands. James had called once, his voice rough over the line, asking about the signing, about Sadie. They'd talked briefly, awkwardly, but it was enough. A thread kept alive, not tight, but there. He'd sent a letter after, a single page from his notebook, a story of a man and a dog by a river, and she'd kept it, tucked in a drawer with Abigail's journal. The truck rumbled as she drove to the Wentworth farmstead one last time, Sadie in the passenger seat where Daisy once sat. The oak tree stood tall, its branches bare now, the small plaque glinting at its base. Daisy, the one who chose the way. Eleanor stepped out, the wind whispering through the leaves, and knelt by the grave, her fingers brushing the bronze. You were right, she murmured, her voice steady. You always knew. Sadie settled beside her, her head resting on Eleanor's lap, and she felt it. A peace that had eluded her for so long, a closing of the circle Daisy had begun. Back home she placed The Dog Who Stayed on the shelf beside Daisy's last tale. The two books a quiet pair, their spines telling a story complete. The cotton fields glowed in the fading light, and Eleanor stood on the porch, Sadie at her side watching the sun sink below the horizon. The ache of loss was still there, a soft echo in her chest, but it was woven with gratitude, for Daisy who'd found her, for Abigail who'd left her a legacy, for James who'd given her truth, and for Sadie who'd stayed. We're home, she whispered, her hand in Sadie's fur, and the wind carried her words across the fields, a final note in a tale fully told. The story was closed, its pages written, its heart beating in the lives it had touched, hers most of all. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.